at 0915 hours on June 4, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, 39 years old, banking his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber at 19,000 feet above the empty Pacific Ocean, stared at his fuel gauge and felt something close to panic, the needle hovering just above the red zone marking the point of no return, his radio crackling with the voices of 32 pilots from Enterprise Air Group who were thinking the same thing. Their commander had gotten them lost, the Japanese fleet was nowhere in sight, and in approximately 12 minutes every aircraft under McClusky's command would reach bingo fuel, the point where they'd have no choice but to turn back toward the carrier or ditch in the ocean and pray the destroyers found them before the sharks did, and McClusky knew exactly what Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance and Captain Miles Browning back on Enterprise were thinking right now, the same thing they'd said 3 hours earlier when McClusky had proposed his search pattern, that Wade McClusky, an Annapolis graduate who'd spent his career flying fighters not bombers, who'd only been promoted to Air Group Commander 6 months ago, after the previous commander got sick, who'd never led a strike force in combat, was about to get 33 aircraft and 99 men killed because he couldn't read a damn navigation chart. Captain Browning had called McClusky's expanded search radius a waste of precious fuel and good pilots, had wanted to launch a second strike toward the coordinates where patrol planes had spotted the Japanese carriers at 0600, coordinates that were now 2.5 hours old, and every other squadron commander in the task force, men with more combat experience, men who'd been at Coral Sea while McClusky was still qualifying carrier landings, had nodded in agreement, thinking what they always thought, that Wade McClusky was a competent enough pilot, but lacked the killer instinct, the aggressive certainty that separated adequate officers from warriors, and now McClusky was proving them right because the ocean below was empty, achingly empty, nothing but whitecaps stretching to every horizon, 30,000 square miles of empty Pacific where 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were supposed to be, carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months ago, carriers that could put 350 aircraft in the sky, carriers that were right now steaming toward Midway Island with every intention of drawing out the American fleet and destroying it in detail, and McClusky had exactly 9 minutes before he'd have to order the turn toward home, 9 minutes to prove that his instinct about where the Japanese would be was correct or admit that Browning had been right, that McClusky had wasted the only striking power Enterprise possessed on a navigation error. But McClusky kept his Dauntless on course heading 240 degrees southwest, away from the coordinates everyone said the carriers would be, because 3 hours ago when he'd launched from Enterprise's flight deck into the pre-dawn darkness, when he'd formed up his 32 bombers and begun the search pattern, McClusky had done something that Captain Browning hadn't accounted for. He'd thought like a Japanese admiral, specifically like Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo commanding the 1st Air Fleet, and McClusky had asked himself a simple question: if I were Nagumo and I just launched a strike against Midway at 0430, and that strike was going to return to my carriers around 0800 needing to rearm and refuel, would I keep my carriers sitting at the same coordinates where American patrol planes had spotted me at 0600, or would I maneuver? Would I turn my fleet northeast to close the distance to where I suspected the American carriers might be? Would I position myself for a counterstrike? And McClusky had bet 99 lives that Nagumo would maneuver, would turn northeast, which meant the Japanese fleet wouldn't be where the patrol planes had seen them 2 hours ago, but somewhere northwest of that position, somewhere along the bearing McClusky was flying right now. But McClusky had thought he knew better, had thought that 4 years at the Naval Academy and 14 years of service and a reputation for being thorough, careful, by the book had earned him the right to trust his own judgment, and Spruance, who was 65 years old and hadn't commanded carriers until 4 days ago when Admiral Halsey went to the hospital with a skin disease, Spruance, who was a cruiserman, a surface warfare officer suddenly responsible for 2 aircraft carriers and their air groups. Spruance would listen to McClusky's explanation and then quietly, without raising his voice, explain that the Battle of Midway was over, that Enterprise and Hornet in Yorktown had exactly 1 chance to hit the Japanese carriers before Nagumo's scouts found the American fleet, one opportunity to attack while the Japanese were rearming from the Midway strike, one window that was closing fast, and McClusky had just wasted it, had just let personal ego and a hunch override combat doctrine, and the war in the Pacific might be lost because Wade McClusky couldn't admit he was wrong. 7 minutes now, McClusky's right hand resting on the stick, his left hand near the throttle, the engine's 1,000 horsepower radial thrumming steady at cruise power, the propeller pulling the Dauntless through thin air at 19,000 feet where the temperature was 15 degrees below zero and McClusky's oxygen mask kept fogging up. His backseat radioman ensign Walter Chocolate silent behind him, not saying what both of them knew, that Lieutenant Dick Best commanding Bombing 6 was probably right now telling his squadron McClusky's lost, we're gonna run out of gas looking for ships that aren't there, and Best was a hotshot, an arrogant pilot who'd made it clear he thought McClusky was too cautious, too conservative, that the air group needed a leader with combat aggression not administrative competence, and when they got back to Enterprise, if they got back, Best would make sure. Everyone knew this disaster was McClusky's fault. 6 minutes, McClusky scanning the horizon again, looking for the white wakes that would mark a fleet doing 25 knots, looking for the black smoke from destroyer stacks, looking for anything that wasn't empty blue water, and seeing nothing. The Pacific lived up to its name, peaceful, serene, completely devoid of 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, their escorting battleships and cruisers, their screen of destroyers, 68 warships. That had vanished somewhere in 30,000 square miles of ocean, and McClusky thought about his wife back in San Francisco, thought about the letter he'd written 3 days ago before Enterprise sortied from Pearl Harbor, the letter that said, if something happens, know that I loved you and I tried to do my duty, the letter every pilot wrote before a combat mission, the letter McClusky had written thinking he might die in combat, not that he might get 99 men killed through incompetence. 5 minutes, and McClusky was about to key his radio, about to give the order to turn back, when Chocolate said over the intercom, "Skipper, 1 o'clock low, looks like a wake," and McClusky swung his head right, looked down through the greenhouse canopy at the ocean 19,000 feet below, and saw a thin white line scratching across the blue. A wake, definitely a wake, a ship's wake, heading northeast, the same course McClusky had predicted Nagumo would take, and McClusky felt his heart rate spike, felt adrenaline dump into his bloodstream, because a single wake meant a single ship, and a single ship out here by itself meant either a submarine or a destroyer, and destroyers didn't travel alone unless they were screening something, unless they were on picket duty protecting a fleet, and McClusky keyed his radio and said, "All aircraft, this is McClusky, I have a surface contact, following to observe," keeping his voice flat, professional, not letting the 32 pilots hear the relief and terror mixing in his chest, and McClusky pushed the stick forward, dropping the Dauntless nose into a shallow dive to close the distance faster, losing altitude to get a better look, and as the altimeter unwound through 17,000 feet, McClusky saw the destroyer more clearly now, maybe 10 miles ahead, making 25 knots, and then McClusky saw what the destroyer was chasing, a long white wake angling away from the destroyer's course, a periscope wake, a submarine running on the surface, American, had to be American, and McClusky thought that submarine must have just attacked the Japanese fleet, must have fired torpedoes, and now it's running like hell with a destroyer chasing it, which means the Japanese fleet is close, within 30 miles, within 20 miles, and McClusky followed the destroyer's back bearing with his eyes, traced an imaginary line northeast from where the destroyer had come from, and at 0955 hours, 4 minutes before he would have ordered the turn toward Enterprise, 4 minutes before the greatest naval battle in history would have been lost, Wade McClusky saw them, saw the white wakes first, multiple wakes, dozens of them, and then the ships themselves, gray rectangles against blue water, and even from 12 miles away at 15,000 feet McClusky could identify the distinctive shapes of Kido Butai, the first air fleet, 4 aircraft carriers in a rectangular formation with their escort vessels arranged around them, and McClusky felt something like religious ecstasy, felt validation and terror in the knowledge that everything, literally everything, the next year of the Pacific War, maybe the entire outcome of the war, depended on what happened in the next 20 minutes, and McClusky keyed his radio and said, "Enterprise Air Group, this is McClusky. I have the enemy carriers in sight. Estimate 4 carriers with escorts, preparing to attack, and from Enterprise 200 miles to the east." Admiral Spruance heard those words in flag plot and felt the weight of the war shift, and McClusky began organizing his attack, began thinking through the tactical problem. He had 33 aircraft, 17 from Bombing 6 led by Dick Best and 16 from Scouting 6 including McClusky's plane, each carrying a single 1,000-pound bomb, and below him were 4 Japanese carriers that had spent the morning launching and recovering aircraft from the Midway strike, and McClusky knew from intelligence briefings that those carriers were now in their most vulnerable state, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, aviation gas lines running across the decks, ordnance carts full of bombs and torpedoes, hundreds of ground crew working in organized chaos, and a single bomb hitting that deck at the right moment could start a chain reaction, could turn an aircraft carrier into a funeral pyre. But McClusky looked at his fuel gauge and saw the needle kissing the red zone, calculated that he had maybe 30 minutes of fuel remaining, maybe less. Not enough time to wait for fighters, not enough time for anything except attacking right now, immediately, before the Japanese carriers could launch their own strike against the American task force, and McClusky made the decision that would define his career. He'd attack without fighter cover, he'd take his 33 bombers down through whatever the Japanese threw at them, because waiting meant losing, and Wade McClusky had spent 8 weeks proving he wasn't competent enough to lead this air group, so he was damn well going to prove he had the guts to finish the mission, and at 1,005 hours McClusky identified his targets, the 4 carriers spread out below in a rectangular formation, 2 carriers in a line to the north, 2 carriers in a line to the south, and McClusky radioed Dick Best, "Best, take Bombing 6 and hit the carrier on the left. I'll take Scouting 6 and hit the carrier on the right," and Best rogered the call, and McClusky pushed over into his attack dive, felt the Dauntless nose drop through the horizon, felt the airspeed build from 130 knots to 180 knots to 240 knots, the aircraft shuddering as it accelerated through thicker air, and McClusky armed his bomb, flipped the switch that removed the safety, felt the confirmation light illuminate, and the Japanese carrier grew larger in his windscreen. Kaga, he thought, recognizing the profile, 26,000 tons, carrying 70 aircraft, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean, and McClusky could see the flight deck clearly now at 8,000 feet, could see aircraft spotted on deck, could see crew running as they spotted the American dive bombers coming down, and then the anti-aircraft fire started. Black puffs of 5-inch shells exploding around McClusky's Dauntless, the concussions buffeting the aircraft, and McClusky kept the dive angle steep, 70 degrees, almost vertical, the carrier centered in his bomb sight, and at 6,000 feet McClusky saw something that made him hesitate for exactly 2 seconds, saw Dick Best's bombers also diving on Kaga, saw that both squadrons were attacking the same carrier instead of splitting targets like McClusky had ordered, and McClusky had a choice: continue the dive and waste bombs on a carrier that Best's squadron was already hitting, or pull out and find another target, and McClusky made his second critical decision, hauled back on the stick, pulled 6GS, felt the blood drain from his head, felt gray tunnel vision closing in, and McClusky brought the Dauntless out of the dive at 4,000 feet, leveled off, and immediately turned toward the second carrier in the northern pair, Akagi, the flagship, Vice Admiral Nagumo's command ship, and McClusky saw 3 other pilots from Scouting 6 following his lead, saw that they'd made the same decision to shift targets, and McClusky rolled into a second dive, pushed over again, built up airspeed again, and this time there was no hesitation. McClusky centered Akagi in his bomb sight, watched the carrier's deck grow from a rectangle to a detailed landscape of aircraft and equipment, could see the red circles on aircraft wings, could see the white wake from the carrier's stern as it tried to maneuver, could see gun muzzles flashing along the deck edge, 25mm anti-aircraft guns firing directly up at McClusky's aircraft, tracers arcing past his canopy, and at 2,500 feet McClusky released his bomb, felt the Dauntless lurch upward as 1,000 pounds dropped away, and McClusky pulled out of the dive again, 6GS again, blood leaving his brain, vision narrowing to a pinpoint, and when the gray tunnel cleared, McClusky looked back over his shoulder and saw his bomb hit Akagi amidships, saw the explosion blossom right where the forward elevator met the flight deck, saw aircraft and equipment vaporize, saw a second explosion as aviation fuel ignited, and then Chocolasek was shouting, "We got her, Skipper, we got her." But the fuel gauge said McClusky had 8 minutes to be right, 8 minutes before he'd have to make the most painful radio call of his career. "All aircraft, this is McClusky, reverse course, return to Enterprise," and McClusky could already hear the silence that would follow, the click of 32 pilots acknowledging the order. Men who'd been awake since 01:30, who'd eaten a breakfast of powdered eggs and coffee, who'd sat in their ready rooms studying silhouettes of Japanese carriers, who'd climbed into their aircraft expecting to strike the decisive blow of the Pacific War, all of them banking their bombers in formation and heading home with their 1,000-pound bombs still attached because their commander couldn't find the target. And when they landed back on Enterprise, if they landed, if the fuel held out and the weather stayed clear and the deck wasn't fouled, McClusky would walk into Admiral Spruance's cabin and explain how he'd guessed wrong, how he'd expanded the search radius based on a hunch about Japanese intentions, how doctrine and experience and every other squadron commander had said to go to the reported coordinates. But McClusky also knew that those 4 carriers had approximately 50 Mitsubishi S-6M0 fighters flying combat air patrol at various altitudes, and once the Zeros saw McClusky's bombers they'd come screaming up to intercept, and the SBD Dauntless had 1 forward-firing 50 caliber machine gun and 1 flexible 30 caliber gun in the back seat, which meant in air-to-air combat against Zeros the American bombers were target practice, and McClusky had no fighter escort because the Grumman F-4F Wildcats from Enterprise had missed the rendezvous that morning, had gotten separated in the pre-dawn launch, so McClusky's bombers were alone, and standard doctrine said to wait, to orbit out of sight and radio Enterprise for fighter cover. And McClusky was already scanning for threats, already looking for the Zeros he knew would be coming. But then he saw something impossible, saw Dick Best's bombers hitting Kaga, saw 3 massive explosions walk down Kaga's flight deck from bow to stern, saw the entire deck erupt in fire, and McClusky looked to the southern pair of carriers and saw them burning too, saw Enterprise's torpedo bombers from the morning strike must have gotten through, saw that all 4 Japanese carriers were burning, saw flames and smoke rising thousands of feet, and McClusky realized that in approximately 5 minutes, from 10:20 to 10:25 hours on June 4, 1942, the American dive bombers had destroyed the 4 carriers that represented Japan's primary striking power in the Pacific, had eliminated in 5 minutes what it had taken Japan a decade to build, and McClusky's fuel gauge was showing empty now, the needle below the red zone, and McClusky keyed his radio and said, "All aircraft, this is McClusky, rendezvous at 20,000 feet. Set course for Enterprise, the mission is successful," and as McClusky climbed back to altitude, weaving to avoid Zero fighters that seemed confused and directionless now that their carriers were burning, he counted his aircraft, counted 31 bombers forming up around him, 2 missing, and McClusky led the formation back toward Enterprise, back toward the carrier that was 210 miles away across empty ocean, and McClusky's fuel gauge said he'd never make it, said he'd flame out and ditch maybe 50 miles short of the carrier. But McClusky leaned the fuel mixture as far as it would go, adjusted the propeller pitch for maximum efficiency, and at 1,155 hours, with his fuel tank showing 0 and his engine beginning to sputter, McClusky saw Enterprise on the horizon, saw the carrier turning into the wind to receive aircraft, and McClusky brought his Dauntless in for landing, felt the tailhook catch the number 3 wire, felt the aircraft jerk to a stop, and when McClusky climbed out of the cockpit his legs were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, and the deck crew told him that his fuel tank contained exactly 6 gallons, enough for 10 minutes of flight, 10 minutes that McClusky hadn't had to spare, and as McClusky walked toward the island structure to report to Admiral Spruance he passed Captain Browning, the man who'd called McClusky's expanded search radius a waste of fuel, and Browning stopped McClusky and said, "You found them, not a question." but a statement, and McClusky said, "Yes, sir, we found them and we hit all 4 carriers," and Browning looked at McClusky like he was seeing him for the first time, like the competent by-the-book administrator had transformed into something else, into a warrior who'd just changed the course of the Pacific War through navigation skill and tactical judgment and raw courage. And when McClusky entered flag plot, Admiral Spruance stood up and shook his hand, and Spruance, who rarely showed emotion, said, "Commander, you've done it, you've evened the odds," and McClusky said, "Sir, I believe we've done more than even the odds. I believe we've won the Battle of Midway." And over the next 3 hours, as scout planes brought reports of the burning Japanese carriers, as Hiria, the last carrier not yet hit, launched a strike against Yorktown, as Enterprise prepared a second strike to finish what McClusky had started, the significance of what happened between 10:20 and 10:25 began to sink in. Wade McClusky's decision to continue searching beyond the recommended radius, his decision to trust his instinct about where Nagumo would maneuver, his decision to attack immediately without fighter cover, his decision to shift targets when he saw best squadron concentrating on one carrier, all of these decisions made by a 39-year-old officer whom everyone thought was adequate but not aggressive, had resulted in the destruction of 4 Japanese carriers, the death of approximately 3,000 Japanese sailors and aviators, and the complete reversal of Japanese naval superiority in the Pacific, and the war that everyone expected would last until 1947 or 1948 would now end in 1945. 3 years earlier, saving an estimated 500,000 American lives, and McClusky's navigation breakthrough, his insight that enemy commanders would maneuver aggressively rather than remaining passive, became standard doctrine in the Naval Air Force, and every aviator who graduated from Pensacola after 1942 learned about McClusky's search pattern at Midway, learned that successful combat leadership required trusting your own judgment even when everyone else doubted you, and McClusky himself flew the second strike that afternoon against Hiria, led his air group down through anti-aircraft fire again, and watched as bombs hit the 4th carrier, as Hiria joined her sisters burning in the Pacific. And when Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor on June 13, McClusky was promoted to commander and awarded the Navy Cross, the citation reading for extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in the line of his profession as officer in tactical command of a bomber group and pilot of a bombing plane in action against enemy Japanese forces in the Battle of Midway on June 4 through 6, 1942. But the words didn't capture what had really happened, didn't capture the moment at 0955 when McClusky saw the destroyer wake, didn't capture the fuel gauge reading empty as he pressed the attack, didn't capture the impossible decision to continue searching when everyone else would have turned back, and McClusky's logbook for June 4 contained a single entry: departed Enterprise 0752, attacked enemy carriers 10:20 to 10:25, landed aboard 11:55, flight time 4 hours 3 minutes, 4 hours that contained 5 minutes that changed everything, and in 1943, McClusky was promoted to captain and given command of his own carrier, and he served through the rest of the war training new pilots, teaching them what he'd learned at Midway, that combat isn't about following doctrine blindly, it's about understanding the enemy's intentions and positioning yourself to exploit their mistakes, and that leadership means making decisions when you don't have complete information, when everyone's telling you you're wrong, when the fuel gauge says you should turn back, but your instinct says the target is just beyond the horizon. And McClusky retired from the Navy in 1956 as a rear admiral, and he died in 1976 at age 73. And at his funeral, Navy pilots who'd never met him, pilots who'd learned his name from history books, came to pay respects to the man who found the Japanese carriers when everyone said they couldn't be found, the man who proved that 33 bombers could defeat 4 carriers if the commander had the courage to press the attack. And today at the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola there's a display about the Battle of Midway, and in that display is Wade McClusky's Flight log from June 4, 1942. And next to the log is his fuel gauge from that mission, the needle still pointing to empty, and the placard reads Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, Enterprise Air Group Commander, Battle of Midway, the man who found the Japanese fleet when fuel said turn back, who attacked when doctrine said wait for cover, who changed history because he trusted his own judgment over everyone else's doubt, and every naval aviator who walks past that display understands that McClusky's legacy isn't just the 4 carriers he helped destroy, it's the principle he proved, that in combat, competence and courage matter more than reputation, that the officer everyone underestimates might be the one who wins the decisive battle, and that 5 minutes of perfect execution can change the course of a war if you're willing to risk everything on your own judgment. And McClusky's search pattern at Midway, the decision to extend beyond the reported coordinates and think like the enemy commander, is still taught at the Naval War College as the textbook example of tactical intuition, and the dive bombing technique his squadrons used, the willingness to shift targets mid-attack to maximize damage, became standard carrier doctrine for the rest of the war, and the estimated 500,000 American lives saved by ending the war 3 years early, that's McClusky's true legacy, not the medals or the promotions, but the mathematics of survival, the calculus that says one man's decision on one morning can propagate through history in ways that save entire generations. And when historians debate the turning points of World War II, they always mention Midway, and when they analyze Midway they always come back to the 5 minutes between 10:20 and 10:25, the 5 minutes when American dive bombers hit 4 Japanese carriers. But what they often miss is the hour before those 5 minutes, the hour when Wade McClusky kept searching while his fuel gauge dropped into the red, the hour when he ignored every instinct that said turn back, the hour when he trusted that his analysis of enemy intentions was correct even though he had no confirmation, no visual contact, nothing but a hunch and a willingness to stake 99 lives on that hunch, and that's the real story of Midway, not the tactical victory, but the moral courage that made the victory possible, the willingness of one officer to be wrong in front of everyone, to accept responsibility for the consequences, to lead from the front even when the front meant flying into uncertainty with an empty fuel tank and no guarantee of finding anything except ocean. And Wade McClusky, the man everyone said was too cautious, too administrative, too by the book, proved at Midway that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is trust the book. That sometimes survival requires throwing out the doctrine and betting everything on your own judgment, and the 5 minutes that destroyed 4 carriers began with 1 minute when McClusky chose not to turn back, 1 minute when he looked at his fuel gauge and his empty horizon and decided that finding the enemy was worth the risk of never making it home, and that decision, that single moment of moral courage, that's what changed the Pacific War, that's what saved 500,000 American lives. That's what ended the war 3 years early, and that's why Wade McClusky's name belongs alongside Nimitz and Halsey and Spruance in the pantheon of officers who won the Pacific, because McClusky won the battle before the first bomb fell, won it through navigation and intuition and the stubborn refusal to believe that 4 Japanese carriers could simply vanish from the ocean. And when you stand at the memorial at Pearl Harbor and read the names of the ships lost on December 7, 1941, remember that those ships were avenged 6 months later by a 39-year-old officer flying a dive bomber at the end of his fuel range, looking at empty ocean and choosing to keep searching, choosing to trust his judgment over everyone else's doubt, choosing to risk everything on 5 minutes of combat that would prove everyone wrong about what one man could accomplish when he refused to turn back.